This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Governments must invest strategically in building safe drinking water systems for the future, not only by increasing funding, if the world's to achieve the goal of universal access. That's the main message from Monday's State of the World's Drinking Water report, issued by the World Health Organization, UN Children's Fund UNICEF and the World Bank. It notes that over 2 billion people have gained access to safe drinking water in the past 2 decades. But that progress is fragile and unequal, with a quarter of the world simply left behind, while climate change increases the frequency and intensity of droughts and floods. Meanwhile, rapid urbanisation is increasing the strain on cities' ability to deliver water to the millions living in informal settlements and slums. The spread of cholera across Syria and Lebanon in recent weeks is alarming, and the risks of it expanding across the whole Middle East call for a scale-up of immediate action, said UNICEF on Monday. Regional Director Bertrand Banvel said in a statement that in Syria there are more than 20,000 cases with acute watery diarrhoea and 75 cholera-associated deaths. In Lebanon, confirmed cholera cases reached 448 in just 2 weeks, with 10 associated deaths. Some other neighbouring countries are already affected with high levels of acute watery diarrhoea, he said, which only adds to children's existing struggles. Malnourished children are more vulnerable, and the outbreak's yet another blow to already overstretched health systems in the region. He said UNICEF urgently needs around $40.5 million to expand its response in Lebanon and Syria alone. And finally, the UN, African Union and regional development body IGAD's trilateral support group for Sudan has expressed its deep sadness at the killing of a young protester in the capital Khartoum on Sunday. Issa Omer al-Bahi is the latest civilian to die in what's become an increasingly violent and unstable situation since the military takeover of the former power-sharing administration exactly a year ago. The trilateral mechanism called for a credible investigation into the death to ensure perpetrators are held accountable. It said the killing, coupled with tragic episodes of violence unfolding in the Blue Nile and West Kordofan, which have so far reportedly claimed over 200 lives, are stark reminders of the urgent need for a political solution to end the current impasse. The group said a legitimate civilian government had to be put in place that would restore security and the constitution, protect civilians and bring justice for the victims and their families. Matt Wells, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. An alert from the UN refugee agency UNHCR about the forced return of asylum seekers from Malaysia to Myanmar. There have been multiple reports of deportations since April, according to UNHCR, with hundreds of Myanmar nationals allegedly sent back against their will in the last 2 months. The practice runs contrary to international humanitarian law and amounts to refoulement, said UNHCR spokesperson Shabir Mantu.
According to information received by UNHCR, an asylum seeker from Myanmar was deported on the 21st of October from detention despite UNHCR interventions. Such deportations of refugees and asylum seekers amount to refoulement.
Myanmar has been gripped by civil war since February, and sending people back there exposes them to harm and danger, the UN agency insisted. The principle of non-refoulement is a cornerstone of international law and is binding on all states, Ms. Mantu told journalists in Geneva. In Ukraine, at least 6,734 civilians have been killed since the Russian invasion on the 24th of February. UN human rights monitors have reported. The scheduled update from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, found that 16,150 non-combatants have also been injured in 8 months of fighting. Of those killed, more than 2,488 were men, 1,700 were women, and at least 368 boys and girls also died. Explosive weapons with wide area effects were responsible for most of the casualties, the OHCHR report said, before highlighting how shelling from heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles and airstrikes had caused the bloodshed. Amid intense ongoing hostilities in Donetsk, Kharkiv and Luhansk regions, the UN monitors said that they had been unable to corroborate reports of numerous additional civilian casualties. Heat waves are an increasingly common health hazard for many nations, but they're set to affect 4 times as many youngsters by 2050, the UN Children's Fund UNICEF warned on Tuesday. According to the UN agency, at least 500 million children are already exposed to a high number of heat waves today, but by the middle of this century, all the world's children, that's more than 2 billion, will be affected, UNICEF said in a new report. This is regardless of whether average temperatures rise by 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, in line with low greenhouse gas emissions modelling, or whether they shoot up by 2.4 degrees if emissions are high. Protecting children from the escalating impacts of heat waves should be a priority for all countries, UNICEF said, in a call for urgent and dramatic emissions mitigation measures to contain global heating and protect lives. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. In Kyrgyzstan, the UN Human Rights Office OHCHR has issued an alert over the arrest and detention of 20 activists who've been trying to protect a reservoir in the southwest of the country. OHCHR said on Wednesday that the individuals face serious criminal charges, including organising mass riots. The development comes as the Kyrgyz authorities prepare to transfer the Kempir Abad reservoir to neighbouring Uzbekistan, in line with a border delimitation agreement. It's widely believed that the activists' detention is linked to their campaign for more transparency in government decision-making, the UN Human Rights Office said, before insisting on people's right to freedom of expression and access to information in Kyrgyzstan. Pre-trial detention should be an exception and only applied when it was reasonable and necessary, said OHCHR spokesperson Liz Throssell. A first from the World Health Organization, WHO, which has just published a list of the planet's top fungal pathogens. WHO's catalogue of 19 fungi prioritises which ones represent the greatest threat to public health, the aim being to promote research and strengthen our response to fungal infections and antifungal resistance. Just how important the issue is was demonstrated during the COVID-19 pandemic, when invasive fungal infections increased significantly among hospitalised patients. There are only 4 types of antifungal medicine available today, and this is a problem as fungal infections are becoming more common and resistant to treatment. Even more worrying, WHO said that most fungal pathogens lack rapid and sensitive diagnostics, and those medicines that exist are not widely available or affordable globally. People at greatest risk of invasive fungal infections include those with cancer, HIV or AIDS, organ transplants, chronic respiratory disease, and tuberculosis. The killing of peaceful pro-democracy protesters in Chad 6 days ago has been strongly condemned by a top UN-appointed independent rights expert. Clément Voul, UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly, also called for the immediate release of hundreds of demonstrators now believed to be in custody. His appeal comes after security forces used live ammunition and tear gas to disperse protesters. They had gathered in the capital N'Djamena and other cities to call for a transition to democracy, but 50 were reportedly killed and nearly 300 were injured. The violence follows the decision to extend the term of President Mahamat Idris Deby Itno by 2 years. He became the country's leader in 2021 after his father, who'd been in power since 1990, was killed during a clash with opposition fighters. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Amid ongoing protests across Iran sparked by the death last month of Mahsa Amini following her arrest by morality police, a top UN-appointed independent rights expert called on Thursday for a high-level probe into the matter. Javed Rehman, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, also expressed alarm that 27 children have been killed so far by security forces, some of them by live ammunition, while others were beaten to death. In a statement, Mr. Rehman said that there had been chronic impunity surrounding Ms. Amini's death. This had culminated in protests throughout the country calling for justice and accountability for Ms. Amini, who died after being arrested for violating strict dress codes relating to her hijab. Iranians were also demanding respect for fundamental rights and particularly freedom of expression, the human rights expert continued, before noting that the protest movement was being led by a range of social classes in different regions, with women and youth at the forefront. Staying with human rights, a call on Thursday from a top UN panel to all countries to protect the human rights of indigenous women and girls everywhere. The appeal from the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, follows what it called the numerous human rights violations and abuses still directed at Indigenous women and girls today. These include gender-based violence, inequality and discrimination, limited access to justice, education, decent jobs and healthcare, simply because of who they are, the panel said in a statement. Concrete measures to help Indigenous women and girls should include their meaningful participation in decision-making, the committee members said, adding that the world's Indigenous population is estimated at more than 476 million today. Current efforts to reduce harmful emissions offer little hope of avoiding climate disaster, UN climate experts said on Thursday, as they appealed for a radical transformation of the energy sector before it's too late. There's no credible pathway to limiting average temperatures rising by more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, warned the UN Environment Programme, UNEP. And this was despite legally binding promises made at the 2015 Paris Climate Conference to cut emissions. Latest data indicates that the world is on track for a temperature rise of between 2.4 and 2.6 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. But if a 45% cut in emissions can be made, global warming will be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, UNEP said, while a 30% reduction should keep average temperature rise to 2 degrees. In addition to ending our reliance on fossil fuels, the UN agency urged a radical overhaul of the food sector, which accounts for 1/3 of emissions. In a related story, a new UN report has found that forests, heaths and stretches of water are more sensitive to nitrogen pollution than previously thought. The report, published under the UNECE Convention on Air Pollution, provides updated thresholds on harmful atmospheric nitrogen pollution. Using data gathered over the last decade, leading European researchers examined a number of ecosystems, and they found that 40% of them were more fragile to nitrogen emissions than expected. The problem is linked to the massive use of fertilizers and organic matter in farming, according to the UN Economic Commission for Europe, which appealed to all governments to reduce the amount of nitrogen entering the environment. Daniel Johnson, UN News.